How to create a schedule that avoids crew overtime. So the day has finally come. You are in the theater after all of the months of preparation and rehearsals, and you're ready to just buckle down, do whatever it takes to make the show happen before opening night. You're dedicated to sleepless nights and long, hard days. And that makes sense from a producer's standpoint. But for the crew, this is just another day at work. And the day before was yet another production that had worked hard and was ready to go. And so, to make sure that the crew have a reasonable life day to day, we have rules for overtime. A key thing to keep in mind here is that while you know your production inside and out because of the months of rehearsal, the technicians are just coming across this for the first time. So they need to be mentally sharp to be able to absorb months of details that you now take for granted that they have never seen before. But on top of all of this, while performing on the stage below is definitely taxing, the technician's job is markedly more dangerous. They're working at heights. Every bolt that they turn has a consequence. And sadly, in some cases throughout history, it has meant the difference between life and death. Technicians cannot be tired and foggy. It's dangerous for them, and it's dangerous for you. Okay, so that's why we have overtime charges. But luckily, avoiding them is just a matter of scheduling. The way crew works at Alderney is you will always have one technician at least in the space with you whenever you are in there. For reasons of liability, we can't just hand over the keys to the space. So you will always be accompanied whenever you are in the space. The way it works is to try to avoid three specific things: weekly overtime, daily overtime, and then meal penalty overtime. Weekly is pretty straightforward. After 48 hours in any sequence of days, the crew jump to time and a half for the next 8 hours. If they're still working after 56 hours, they jump to double time. Now, this only holds true for very long productions, and the way to reset this is to schedule a day off for the technician. Daily overtime kicks in after 10 hours at time and a half, and in extreme circumstances, after a 14-hour day, it goes to double time. But really, this is a mistake of scheduling if we come to that point. And I should say that unlike weekly overtime or meal penalty overtime, an hour or two of daily overtime tends not to break a budget. If you happen to work 11 hours in one day, it really just adds an extra half an hour to your day, so an extra half-hour rate per person. That tends not to be a big issue. And this is a good time to mention some other details. We have a minimum 4-hour call at Alderney, so we're not making people come over the harbor to come to work for 2 hours. So minimum 4 hours is a shift. And if they have a 4-hour call and then they have a 2-hour lunch and then come back again, anything over 2 hours starts a new 4-hour call. This is to avoid someone being brought over and then sitting around for 3-4 hours waiting for an extra half an hour of work. It's just really not fair to make someone sit around when they could be working somewhere else for an afternoon shift. Now, meal penalty overtime is the one you really want to watch because it adds up quickly and it compounds on top of other infractions. It works like this. A technician can work a max of 5 hours. At that point, they stop and they get a 1-hour break. If they do not get a 1-hour break, they instantly charge a 1-hour meal penalty charge at their hourly rate for going over that 5-hour span. And they also jump to time and a half until they get their 1-hour break. Now, as you can imagine, that can add up very quickly. So you definitely want to avoid it, or at least understand it when you're making up your schedule and include it in your budget. The big takeaway is if you want to avoid meal penalty overtime, just schedule a 1-hour break every 5 hours. Now, if your show is a typical one-day production, I find it's easier to schedule backwards from the end of the show. So if your show, say, runs from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, I like to put in what I call a safe end at maybe 10:30 because pretty much every show goes a little bit longer than you think it's going to. So I would say safe end at 10:30, 8 to 10 for a show. Then at 7:30 we would have the doors to allow front of house to get the audience in. From 5:30 to 7:30, I would say final checks and any musical sound checks. If you have a musician, they often want to minimize the amount of time they are in the space because it maximizes the amount of money they're getting. So they want to show up at the last minute, do a quick sound check, and then be brought out on stage and then get to go home. So there's always a bit of a battle to get them in for a sound check. So save this at the end for them. It's unfortunate for the technicians because it crams some very important work into the last moments, and if anything goes wrong, it can be quite stressful. But that's typically how it goes. So save that for them. That means supper would be from 4:30 to 5:30, and then for the 5 hours before that, from 11:30 a.m. until 4:30 p.m., you can do your tech setup and rehearsal, and that's projections, lighting, any cueing, anything that needs to be set up. And if you do have to do more than that, if you just have high expectations for the show or there's just a lot that has to happen, the technicians can come in earlier and take a lunch from 10:30 to 11:30 and come in at say 8:30 until 10:30 to do early setup. Again, it doesn't really break the bank. If you add 2 hours for a technician, you're really only paying 1 hour of overtime, so it's probably not going to break the budget. But one thing you do want to keep in mind is that at the end of the show, the technicians will take, their hour lunch, and then they have to come back and strike all of the setup that they did for you and restore the theater back to the condition it was for the next person who comes in. Of course, this is important because you don't want to have to pay to clean up somebody else's mess. So just keep in mind that there will likely be, depending on how much setup you have, anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half to 8 hours if you have a massive show for strike and restore. So just keep that in mind when you're budgeting, and it's one of the conversations we'll have as we're figuring out your schedule. Now, please understand, this is an exercise. There are no two shows alike, and so therefore there are no two schedules alike. But hopefully this will help you get the ball rolling and help you understand how to avoid overtime charges as you're creating your preliminary schedule.